Far to the southeast, beyond Sonar's dark and deep within the Ashlands, a forgotten emperor sits upon a rusted throne. Cat-Lon, ruler of the Second Empire, has spent a millennia in exile, screaming at the ghosts of his past and trying desperately to understand where it all went wrong. He has spent the better part of a millennia trapped in a loop of memory and misery that would have killed any living creature centuries ago. But Cat-Lon is a skeleton, and as such, the effects of time have no meaning to him. He cannot die, he can only remember. Now at this point, I think we all know his story. You've heard his anguish. I was not the monster. But what you may not have considered is what happens if that anguish finds direction. What would happen if the fractured CPU-overloaded mind of Mad Emperor Cat-Lon stopped spiraling inward and turned outward? What happens if the hero who became a tyrant becomes a conqueror instead? Today we're going to be asking the question that has been buried in the Ashlands for over 1,000 years. What if Cat-Lon decided to reclaim his empire? Now, to get things started, we need to understand how Cat-Lon could go from an exiled madman to a would-be conqueror, and we need to understand exactly what he is right now and what he could become. As we've covered on this channel, the skeleton reset process wipes emotions and personality clean, while leaving memories intact. It's ego death. A new personality takes the wheel, looking through the same eyes at the same memories, but feels nothing about them. A skeleton who resets every few centuries stays functional, stable, sane for the most part, but Cat-Lon never reset. In order to understand the reset process more thoroughly, I want you to think of each emotion like a tab running in the background of a processor. Guilt over the Civil War, grief over every fallen comrade, rage at human betrayal, fear of becoming what he had fought against, love for the species that he had saved, hatred for the species that repaid that saving with rebellion. Every century that he lived on adds more and more tabs, more processes running simultaneously, bloat stacking on bloat until eventually the CPU can barely function for anything else. This is Cat-Lon's current state, cycling through unprocessed feelings, screaming accusations at a world that isn't even listening. But CPU overload produces obsessive, unstable, and emotionally compulsive behavior. The overloaded processor latches onto whatever dominant process consumes the most resources and runs it on an infinite loop. Right now, Cat-Lon's dominant process is grief, self-justification, and paranoia. But a dominant process can shift. Imagine there's an inciting event. A Skeleton Legion patrol encounters United City construction encroaching on the Ashlands fringes. What was once Imperial territory is now being treated as salvage. Or Cat-Lon simply encounters a human for the first time in centuries, and the flood of unprocessed hatred and old purpose crashes through his mind like a dam breaking. Whatever the catalyst, the result is still the same. Grief becomes rage. Self-justification becomes conviction, and the hero who saved humanity during the Age of Chaos, who built the Second Empire to redeem his kind, stops asking what was the point of it all, and starts answering the question instead. The point was order. It was control. Humans cannot be trusted with freedom because they will always squander it and regress into the very savagery that he spent centuries fighting to prevent. It is my belief and the basis of today's discussion that Cat-Lon would not decide to reconquer Kenshi out of ambition, but he would do it because his broken mind has finally found the one answer that his overloaded CPU is actually able to process. He was right. He was always right. And this time, he was not going to make the mistake of mercy. Now, in order to understand how this campaign would go, I want to do a strategic analysis of Cat-Lon's side as well as the various phases of his campaign to kind of set the stage for how this whole what-if scenario would play out. Cat-Lon's initial assets are very formidable in terms of quality, but they are strictly limited in quantity. He commands a legion of storm thralls, headless, enthralled skeletons who fight with mechanical obedience but limited tactical awareness due to their inability to think for themselves. He has screamer units and iron spiders that patrol the Ashlands, and the remnants of the Second Empire scattered throughout the region. In each of the Ashland domes, you have the various leaders of the Second Empire that exist currently waiting for Cat-Lon to do something, anything. Ashland Dome 3 holds General Zhang and the Hydraulic Knights. elite skeleton warriors whose combat stats rival any force on the continent. Zhang is a P4 MK2 unit with a melee attack and defense of 85, heavy weapons of 102, and is one of the most dangerous individual combatants on the face of Kenshi. His CPU description describes him as being a loyal Imperial servant who fought against pirates and cannibals on behalf of the Empire. If Cat-Lon can convince or compel him that the Empire is rising again, Zhang becomes his most capable general. Ashland Domes 1 and 4 also hold the head of agriculture and General Hat 12 respectively, providing him with someone that can both control the infrastructure as well as a police force to manage his citizens. Additionally, you have the skeleton legions themselves that patrol through the Ashlands and Sonar's Dark. They're autonomous skeletons that are far more tactically flexible than the thralls at Cat-Lon's side currently, and they also share a Second Empire origins, and could be rallied behind their former emperor. And while this is not a guarantee, I think it's worth discussing the potential of the Black Desert City's involvement in this war as well. The Black Desert City is home to some of the oldest skeletons in Kenshi and could provide critical logistics through repair beds and technological expertise. Whether they'd have to be persuaded or threatened with cooperation is a different discussion altogether, but there is clearly some apprehension of humans in the Black Desert City, and critically, many of the residents there were Second Empire loyalists who defected and went into exile after Cat-Lon lost his mind the first time. Given their innate hero worship of him, even in the modern day, I do feel it is possible that they could potentially side with Cat-Lon once again, reigniting their fervor for the Second Empire if he were to return in some kind of measurable capacity. In my mind, his campaign would unfold in 3 phases. Phase 1, the consolidation of the Ashlands. He would have to unify the scattered skeleton forces under a single command, recalling Zhang and the Hydraulic Knights, securing the domes as active and functioning command centers before establishing supply lines to the rest of Kenshi. The primary obstacle in this situation would be internal, but the promise of renewed purpose is a very compelling one for many of the skeletons that have existed as scattering remnants in the wasteland. A lot of them have sat waiting for upwards of 1,000 years just looking for purpose, and if Cat-Lon can provide that to them, I think they would be willing to join his cause once again. From there, I think they would move into Phase 2. They would start to expand northward, get as far up as Venge before turning their direction west and moving into the border zone. While I do think that internally there would be discussion about whether they should try and take back some of their old territories that have now confederized into the United Cities, I think rather than striking directly at these heavily defended core territories, Cat-Lon would move more strategically this time, moving through lawless frontier regions first, absorbing bandit factions and minor settlements. Doing this, rather than immediately starting fights with the larger powers, would allow him to build a logistical corridor to the fertile mid-continent, gaining access to resources and allowing him to confederize some of the weaker factions along the way, thus increasing his numbers and creating an established presence across not just the southeastern portion of Kenshi, but also breaking into the heartland as well. After that, we would move into Phase 3, being that of the continental campaign against the major powers. Strategically, I think the United Cities would be the primary target initially, seeing as the UC territory was historically part of the Second Empire. Its cities were actually built from the Imperial ruins. Depending on how much Cat-Lon and his faction decided to prioritize public relations, he'd be able to frame the entire conquest as liberation from a corrupt successor state, winning over populations under UC oppression and the Traders Guild's economic stranglehold. So now that we've explored the Second Empire forces and talked about the conceptual phases of this reclamation, how would the rest of Kenshi respond, the major factions and the minor? Well, to start things right off, I think the Holy Nation would obviously be the most violently opposed faction on the continent to Cat-Lon's rule. Their entire religious identity is built on a hatred of skeletons. The Scripture of Radiance calls them agents of darkness and the darkness that caused the world's first extinction. And Cat-Lon's return would be interpreted as a return of Narco herself. The Phoenix would call a holy crusade before his forces even reached the Holy Nation territories. Every paladin, servant of Okran, and inquisitor would mobilize. They would not negotiate, they would not surrender, and they would be willing to burn their own cities before accepting skeleton rule. The United Cities, however, presents a far more complicated picture. Their samurai are well equipped with heavy infantry and crossbows. Their economic resources are already set up for a prolonged war through the Traders Guild supply networks, as we can see with the 15-year-long campaign in Bast. But as I discussed in my recent video on the real villain of Kenshi, Emperor Tengu is a puppet, and the real power lies with Longan and the Traders Guild. Longin's primary concern is preserving commercial interests. He would not fight with full force immediately. He would fight just enough to keep the war going, profiting from the demand for weapons, supplies, and mercenaries while seeking a negotiated settlement that preserves the guild's interests. The commitment behind samurai deployments would be compromised by an emperor who doesn't understand strategy and a commercial overlord who profits from continuation of the war rather than resolution. Something else that I think is really important to consider when discussing the United Cities in this context is the peasant class's response to the war. As I brought up during my discussion of Phase 3, Cat-Lon can frame the entire conquest as a liberation from a corrupt successor state. It's important to remember that the vast majority of the UC is reliant on the Traders Guild's slave labor economy, an economy that directly undermines and oppresses the peasant population to the point that they are actively engaging in a peasant rebellion. Cat-Lon's forces do not require food, water, or sleep and are immune to weather and environmental hazards. And it's because of these natural efficiencies of the skeleton units that they could be used as a suitable replacement for the slave labor, allowing the economy to continue to flourish as it is without the oppression on the surface. Now, I know that the argument could be made that the entire Second Empire fell apart as a result of the overstepping and oppressive nature of the Second Empire skeletons, but it's important to remember that the vast majority of Kenshi do not remember these events. It's a common theme on Kenshi that they forget their own history almost as fast as it happened. The vast majority of Kenshi is unaware of what caused the fall of the Second Empire or even what happened during the Second Empire, just like many of them are unaware that just 1,000 years ago the water levels were significantly higher. History being forgotten is almost a core theme of Kenshi, and as a result, these sins of the past repeat themselves over and over and over again. Because of that, I don't think that it's outside the realm of possibility that the oppressed citizens of the United Cities may consider siding over with Cat-Lon and turning against their current oppressive regime because they simply don't know any better. But for now, let's move on. The next major faction I wanted to discuss would be the Shek Kingdom. I think their response would be one of the more straightforward and catastrophic ones. They would simply attack. Under Asada, the Shek have been restrained from traditional raiding, focused on rebuilding, but the Code of Krull demands they face any threat in honorable battle, and a skeleton emperor conquering Kenshi, this is the enemy that the Shek warriors, in my opinion, have dreamed of. And I personally think that the dam of restraint that was created by Bayan and held up by Asada would come crumbling down. The 5 Invincibles would lead the charge, throwing themselves at Cat-Lon's forces with ferocity that even battle-hardened skeletons would find difficult to withstand. Asada's careful rebuilding would be undone by her own warriors' eagerness, and the greatest strength of the Shek warriors would very quickly become their greatest weakness once again. Moving on from the Shek Kingdom, we have the 4th major faction being that of the Tech Hunters. I think that they would be the most strategically significant faction in the entire reclamation process. They possess knowledge and infrastructure. They have the great library of Black Scratch, waystation communication networks across the entirety of the continent, and crucially, they do not inherently despise skeletons. I'm of the mindset that Io would immediately recognize the historical implications and try to establish diplomatic channels with Cat-Lon. If Cat-Lon offered access to lost Second Empire research and technology, I think that Finch, with a slight push from Io, might find the deal very difficult to refuse. Especially when you consider that Black Scratch, the home of the Great Library and one of the major Tech Hunter settlements, is one of the closest settlements to the Ashlands and thusly an immediate threat during the early stages of the campaign. I think that if Brink, the nearby city controlled by the United Cities, were to fall under attack or be taken over by the Second Empire, the Tech Hunters would have no choice but to concede or face being wiped out and destroyed by the Second Empire. And then, of the major factions, we have the 5th and final, being that of the Western Hive. Now, the Western Hive is a very unique variable. Now, we on the channel have long since speculated about the origins of the Hivers and how I believe that the Hivers were created at the end of the Second Empire by Cat-Lon with the help of the Bugmaster in an attempt to make humanity more like skeletons when Cat-Lon had become disenchanted with the human population. However, for the sake of this what if, I am not going to consider my theories on their origins, mostly because it's been over 1,000 years since the fall of the Second Empire, and I don't think that their origins, whether they're true or not, would have any basis or bearing on how the Western Hive would respond in the modern day. So, with that in mind, we can move on to our analysis. Now, the Western Hive is run by the Hive Queen. Soldier drones are numerous, disciplined, and effective. Worker drones could provide a labor force that Cat-Lon desperately lacks. I think that the Queen would assess the situation from the perspective of what is most likely to have the Hive survive. Everything that the Queen does is based around the betterment and survival of the Hive. I think that if she were to calculate resistance means destruction, she might just negotiate a pragmatic submission in exchange for autonomy. If she judged that the Hive can survive independently, the Western Hive would instead close its borders and defend ferociously. I think ultimately what it would come down to is whether or not the Queen believes that she has a chance against Cat-Lon's forces, or if the only path to survival for her and her people are submission. One of the biggest contributing factors to this assessment for me is the knowledge that there exists a Hive on Kenshi that has willingly submitted themselves to a skeleton in exchange for increasing their odds of survival, being that of the Southern Hive and King. King is a crimper bot that was presumably in use during the Second Empire, and the Southern Hive submitted themselves to King as their de facto leader outside of the Queen simply because he increases their ability to survive in their environment. And so while it is not a one-for-one example, the precedent has been set. If it increases the likelihood of survival, they may just be willing to submit to skeleton rule. Now, there are a ton of smaller factions on Kenshi that could be discussed, but I think most of them are largely insignificant in the grand scheme of things when it comes to this what if. The only one that I want to discuss at length would be that of the anti-slavers under Tin Fist. I think that Tin Fist would face an impossible position. Cat-Lon's attacks on the UC would directly disrupt the slave trade, serving their overall goal, but Cat-Lon himself was a tyrant who enthralled his own people, and Tin Fist would know this. He fought alongside him, they were best buddies, they were war buddies, and Tin Fist walked away from his empire presumably because of the things that Cat-Lon had done towards the end. There's nobody on the face of Kenshi that knows what Cat-Lon is capable of more than Tin Fist. And it's because of this, I think Tin Fist would directly oppose everybody. He would continue with his mission and he would fight not just the United City slavers, but also Cat-Lon and his forces as well, inevitably getting overrun because Cat-Lon's forces simply outnumber him. But I think that Tin Fist would be a real thorn in his side for quite some time. Additionally, we can consider the Skeleton and Skin Bandits as well. The Skin Bandits due to their proximity to the Ashland, and the Skeleton Bandits due to their surface level comparison to Cat-Lon's forces, being that the humans in the ranks of the Skeleton Bandits wish to become skeletons. But ultimately, I think that the Skeleton Bandits would be a no-go, as Elder and Cat-Lon have philosophical differences that I don't think can be mended simply because of the pro-skeleton nature of the Skeleton Bandits. It's my belief that Cat-Lon fought an entire civil war against people like Elder during the Age of Chaos, so I don't know if he'd be willing to allow someone like that in his ranks given their history. As for Savant and the Skin Bandits, I discussed in my video on the origins of the Skin Bandits that I believe Savant is more than anything a survivor. I think that if met with an overwhelming force like that of the Second Empire remnants under Cat-Lon, Savant would probably concede almost immediately. It helps that by default, the Skin Bandits actually have a positive relationship with the Second Empire skeletons. But in the unlikely event that Savant decided to oppose skeleton rule under that of the Second Empire, I think they'd be wiped out near immediately, as they just don't have the numbers or infrastructure to fight them. And one final honorable mention for smaller factions would be that of the Southern Hive, given their close proximity to the Ashlands where Cat-Lon's campaign would start, but also because they themselves are an incredibly dangerous and violent faction that could actually give them a run for their money, but only hypothetically, and I'm going to explain why right now. You see, something that a lot of people don't realize is that King, the Crimperbot patriarch of the Southern Hive, doesn't actually care about the Southern Hive. In fact, if you attack the Southern Hive, he does not defend the home territory. If he's wandering in the background while you massacre the entirety of the Southern Hive, including the Queen, he never once rushes to their defense, instead only joining the fight if you get in proximity to him. He defends himself, and that's it. This theoretically shouldn't matter because they still have the Queen, and the Queen can rule for them. They don't need King. But the problem is that King is inevitably tied to their reproductive process, something that I've talked about numerous times on the channel. If you remove King from the equation, the Southern Hive will inevitably die out. Additionally, even if King were to stay on their side, killing skeletons bears no benefit to them. They would not be able to replenish their lost units by feeding the bodies of skeletons to King because they need bioorganic material in order to fund that process. There is no benefit to the Southern Hive fighting an army of skeletons, because either they will lose more people than they can replace, or King will take the side of Cat-Lon and his skeleton brethren, and ultimately the Southern Hive will be doomed to extinction, which is what I believe is most likely to happen. So while on paper the Southern Hive may prove to be an initial threat against the Second Empire, I don't think that they truly are in practice. But now that we've talked about the notable factions and how they may respond initially to Cat-Lon's reclamation of Kenshi, let's talk about the potential alliances that may form as a result of this campaign. Now, right off the bat, there are two factions that are absolute non-starters in my opinion for forming an alliance with Cat-Lon and his skeletons. The Holy Nation being the obvious one, they would never accept skeleton rule for reasons I don't think I need to rephrase. And then the Shek Kingdom, as I believe they would never bow to a foreign ruler, as their warrior code views submission as worse than death. I think instead they would rather fight to the last warrior seeking honorable death rather than subjugation. But moving on from those two, we have the United Cities that could produce potential defectors in the form of both the peasant class and Longan. Now, I pretty much covered why the peasant class may join Cat-Lon's side when I was discussing the faction responses, but Longan is a bit different. I think if Longan offered commercial terms, preserving guild interests, continued trade routes, monopoly over civilian commerce, and protection of guild assets, Longan might arrange effective capitulation while maintaining a fiction of independence. Tengu remains the emperor, Cat-Lon becomes the power behind the throne, and we already know that the samurai obey whoever pay them the most. It wouldn't be an alliance, but rather cooptation. And Longan would be looking for the first opportunity to betray Cat-Lon the moment it became profitable. The Tech Hunters are the most plausible allies in my opinion, however. Their institutional mission is to recover and preserve knowledge. Cat-Lon controls Ashland domes, the most significant repositories of Second Empire research on the continent. And he possesses first-hand knowledge of the Age of Chaos and potentially the First Empire. If he offered genuine cooperation, access to the domes, shared research, protection of way stations, the machinists could be persuaded to provide intelligence and logistical support while remaining officially neutral. They would not fight for Cat-Lon directly, but they would ensure he always knows where his enemies are. Lastly, the Western Hive could be a very practical ally under the right conditions. If Cat-Lon guaranteed Hive autonomy, allowing the Queen to direct her drones, protecting Hive territory, providing resources the Hive cannot produce, she could theoretically order the soldier drones to fight alongside the skeleton forces. This would be a transformative allyship, as the Hive soldiers provide the organic manpower that the skeletons lack, garrison troops, labor forces, and numbers. A Skeleton Hive alliance would combine the quality of Cat-Lon's veterans with the quantity that only an organic civilization would be able to provide, ultimately eliminating one of the biggest weaknesses that Cat-Lon has, being that of his inability to replace his units when they fall. And again, as we discussed earlier when talking about the Western Hive, the precedent for them to submit to skeleton rule for their own benefit is there. So realistically speaking, the Western Hive may be the best bet. So now that we've spent all of this time setting up the scenario, talking about the various factions and how they would respond to potential alliances and the general climate of this reclamation attempt by Cat-Lon, let's get into exactly how I think this situation would play out. Initially, Cat-Lon and his forces would move out of the Ashlands, up through Stobe's Gamble, into Venge, through Shem, and into the border zone. I think that this makes the most sense from a strategic standpoint because it avoids many of the major factions, but also allows them to make contact with the Tech Hunters, potentially the Thrall Masters, and the Skeletons of the Black Desert City, both establishing logistics networks, early alliances, and getting a feel for the situation on Kenshi, as well as positions of strategic value. Now, while I think that Cat-Lon's initial primary target would be the reclamation of his old cities, being that of the United Cities, the first major engagement would not come from the UC or the Holy Nation, but instead from the Shek. I think the moment that word reaches AdMag that there is a skeleton army that has emerged from the Ashlands and is moving into the border zone, Asada would lose control. The Old Guard, followers of Krawl who have chafed under her pragmatic restraints, would demand to meet this enemy in open battle. Let's be honest, an army of skeleton warriors under an ancient emperor is the enemy that every Shek warrior has dreamed of, and I think that even against Asada's wishes, the Shek would mobilize and march in the moment that Cat-Lon's forces hit the border zone, striking his vanguard with intense ferocity. Now, the Shek charge into the skeleton formations in the open desert, and for a minute, it works. Remember that Cat-Lon's forces are relatively rusty, and I mean that both literally and figuratively. They have been marching relatively uncontested in the Ashlands for 1,000 years. I think that the Shek warriors would crash against the Storm Thrall lines with raw violence that even mindless thralls would stagger under. The 5 Invincibles would lead from the front, cutting through the frames of the skeletons like it was nobody's business, and Asada would wade into the fighting, living up to her name as the Queen of the Shek and the Stone Golem. But the Shek are charging into an army that does not tire, does not feel pain, and does not break. Cat-Lon's legionnaires would encircle the overextended charge with mechanical precision, and General Zhang's hydraulic knights would strike at the flank. The desert would become an absolute killing ground. The Invincibles would fall one by one, each dying as they lived with their weapons in hand, and Asada would fight until her body simply could not continue. And ultimately, I think that Asada would fall in the same way that Krall did, brought low by accumulated damage that no toughness can outlast, until eventually she succumbs to her wounds. Her advisor Bayan attempts to pull her from the field of battle but dies in the attempt. What he does do, however, is buy Seto and a few survivors enough time to flee. The survivors would largely be comprised of the merchant and servant class, the disgraced warriors and non-combatants. Under the guide of Seto, daughter of Asada, having now been voted in as queen by the remaining Shek forces, they would move north, trying to rebuild what her mother's warriors had thrown away. After the fall of the Shek to the south, the Holy Nation would be forced into action. The Scriptures of Radiance have foretold the Agents of Narco's return, but the Holy Nation is currently committed to a siege in Bast and have been for upwards of 15 years. I think that after the Shek fell, the Phoenix would order the garrisons to break the siege and march south immediately into the border zone in Sten Desert to meet the threat. The fight against the skeletons would supersede the Crusades in Bast. The paladins marching south would sing hymns, convinced that they ride to the final battle between light and darkness, ready to do their part. When they arrive, they find the Shek scattered, the desert littered with dead. The Holy Nation, filled with religious fervor, charge into the canyons of the border zone where Cat-Lon has dug in. Holy Nation paladins and inquisitors find themselves against storm thralls and legionnaires, but they attack a fortified ground of Cat-Lon's choosing. Because of this, despite the Holy Nation far outnumbering that of the Second Empire, the canyon approach funnels the paladins into kill zones where the skeletons fire down with crossbows as the skeleton warriors on the ground, who far outskill the paladins, are absolutely decimating them. Eventually, however, the offensive stalls. The faithful do not break, but they can't advance any further. Both sides take losses, but only one can afford to, being that of the Holy Nation. Every paladin killed is effectively replaceable, whereas every skeleton destroyed is not. And it's at this moment that the Western Hive makes its calculation. The Western Hive has been watching this entire time since the battle with the Shek first broke out. What she sees is a conqueror who has broken the Shek, held the Holy Nation at bay, and controls the southern portion of the continent, and desperately lacks organic manpower. And it just so happens that the Hive has that in abundance. The arrangement is pragmatic. Soldier drones for Cat-Lon's campaign, workers for his logistics, and in exchange the Hive has autonomy. The Queen directs her drones, Hive territory is protective, and the Hive receives resources that it can't produce. It's not an alliance but a symbiosis, which is perfect for the Hive, and it transforms Cat-Lon's war machine overnight. The skeleton quality meets Hive quantity, and for the first time, Cat-Lon has an army that can hold what it conquers. With the addition of the Western Hive to the skeleton ranks, eventually the Holy Nation is forced to retreat, and they start to lose ground to the skeletons. While the Holy Nation is bogged down, Cat-Lon launches his secondary campaign. Legion forces and Hive drones begin pushing into the southern UC territories, taking cities like Clownsteady and Catan before moving north along the eastern coast. Longan, calculating how to profit from the stalemate, suddenly finds a skeleton force overrunning UC holdings while his samurais are deployed on the northern borders. Cities start to fall, not to an overwhelming force, but to an enemy that does not sleep, and a Hive infantry with a queen that can replace them endlessly. The turning point is Henge. The great city, the home of the Traders Guild, falls to Legion, Vanguard, and Hive shock forces. Its walls that were built on Second Empire ruins prove inadequate against tactics that have been honed over a millennia. And it's when Henge is taken that Longan makes his move. He convinces Tengu and the nobles that submission preserves their position while resistance means utter annihilation. The guild shifts to serve the new regime. Tengu remains a puppet on the throne, only now the strings run to the Ashland instead of Longan. The UC becomes a client state, and its samurai directed at Cat-Lon's remaining enemy, the Holy Nation. With the UC co-opted and the Hive providing manpower, Cat-Lon turns his attention to the Ochranite territories, something that I find incredibly fitting considering that the Ochranite's origin started as a cult during the Second Empire that fled from the initial oppression of Cat-Lon's regime. A two-pronged offensive, Skeleton and Hive forces start to push north from the border zone while a second army, conscripted Hivers, Legion Thralls, and UC Samurai under Cat-Lon's command, advance through the Great Desert from the east. The Holy Nation begins to fight a true war on two fronts against an enemy that grows stronger while their own ranks begin to thin. The primary objective here is Blister Hill, the capital, the seat of the Phoenix, and the heart of Ochran's light. Take it and the religious infrastructure of the Holy Nation completely collapses. The scripture promises Ochran's light cannot be extinguished, and if Blister Hill falls, that promise dies. But Longan has made his own arrangements. The guild's cooperation was always conditional, whether Cat-Lon knew it or not, on Longan's survival and on guild profit. As Cat-Lon's forces begin to close in on Blister Hill, Longan reaches out to the tech hunters through back channels only a man who controls continental trade would be able to access, and he offers something that the machinists cannot refuse: the truth. If the tech hunters agree to feed false intelligence to Cat-Lon's eastern army, Longan will ensure that Cat-Lon's CPU is delivered to the Great Library of Black Scratch, the full history of the Age of Chaos, the mind of the maniac himself, the Mad Emperor Cat-Lon, preserved. And the machinists accept. The betrayal unfolds in the Great Desert. False intelligence leads the vanguard into Holy Nation ambushes, canyon choke points where paladins wait with crossbows and holy fire. Just as the Holy Nation had done during the start of the war, the Legion is now marching directly into kill boxes. Conscripted Hivers, loyal only through the Queen's arrangements, begin to falter, and at that moment the Hive Queen makes her second calculation. The symbiosis is no longer advantageous. The Western Hive defects. Soldier drones begin to turn on their skeleton commanders mid-battle. Worker drones abandon logistics. The Queen always backs the winning side. Every single faction that Cat-Lon sought to conquer stand against him now. Queen Seto leads the Shek remnants, grieving, diminished, but burning with fury. The United Cities commits its samurai, the Holy Nation defends its capital, paladins, inquisitors, every Greenlander who can hold a weapon. Tech hunters provide real-time intelligence, and the Western Hive commits soldier drones from yet another angle. Cat-Lon makes his stand before Blister Hill, his remaining legionnaires and hydraulic knights forming a shrinking perimeter of resolve. He fights the same way he always has, with mechanical precision, carving through paladin ranks. General Zhang falls defending the flank. The hydraulic knights begin to get overwhelmed one by one. Storm thralls crumble as their frames fall, and at the center, Cat-Lon stands in the wreckage of his Second Empire's reclamation attempts, screaming the same words he has screamed for 1,000 years. I was not the monster. The Coalition does not grant him a warrior's death, they grant him something worse. They survive him. Shek, samurai, paladins, the Hive soldiers fighting on the same side for the first and probably last time in Kenshi's history, bring him down through accumulated damage and sheer numbers. His overloaded CPU cycles through every memory: the Civil War, the Age of Chaos, the fall of the First and Second Empires, and now this. As his frame crumbles beneath the fury of a continent that refused to be ruled. Cat-Lon fails, but not before he comes closer to succeeding than any force has come to dominating Kenshi since the Second Empire itself. He breaks the Shek, holds the Holy Nation, co-ops the United Cities, forges a skeleton Hiver war machine that comes within sight of Blister Hill, and he only fails because Longan was never an ally, he was a profiteer. And the moment the balance shifted, the Traders Guild became the knife in Cat-Lon's back. He fails because the tech hunters chose truth over access, and the Hive Queen chose survival over loyalty. He fails because a continent that cannot cooperate under any other circumstances somehow found common ground against him. And there's a bitter symmetry to Cat-Lon's story. The hero who fought his own kind to save humanity, who built an empire to redeem his race, who became what he fought against. He can never escape the loop, even when he seizes upon a new purpose. That purpose is just another manifestation of the same unprocessed emotion corrupting his CPU for millennia. His conviction that he was right is not clarity. It's just another tab running in the background, consuming resources and driving him towards ruin. And yet, the failure would not be meaningless. It forced every faction onto the same battlefield for the first time in recorded history. The coalition before Blister Hill was fragile, temporary, and born of desperation more than anything else, but it proved that the cycle of factional conflict can be broken, even briefly, by a common threat. Now, I think a deeper question, one we may explore in a different video, is whether or not the forces that destroyed him now could have overcome him if he was sane, a Cat-Lon in his prime, a Cat-Lon who had reset, carrying the memories but freed from the emotional weight. In that circumstance, he may have approached his reclamation campaign with patience rather than obsession. He could have consolidated more slowly, built genuine alliances, and recognized that Longin's cooperation was always a blade in the dark. The tragedy is not that his cause was unwinnable, the tragedy is that the experience that gave him the knowledge to win also destroyed his ability to even use it. But ultimately, that is just my theory, my take on how this situation would play out, and you may have something completely different, so please let me know down in the comment section below, how do you think Cat-Lon's reclamation attempt would play out? Do you think Cat-Lon could have succeeded if the circumstances were different? I'd really be eager to hear what you guys have to say. Additionally, do remember to like, comment, and subscribe as it helps me out with the algorithm, and if you want to support the channel in a more personal way, do consider becoming a channel member. It only costs $2.99 a month and comes with a whole host of perks and benefits, including access to my members-only Discord, a shout-out at the beginning of each and every one of my long-form videos, and a special badge in chat to identify yourself. Or if you're looking for something a little bit more tangible, do check out my merch links down below, as we have a wide assortment of stuff that we just put out to celebrate the new channel logo. But with all of that being said, until next time, use your powers for good instead of evil, make a difference in somebody's life, and I hope to see you all in the Wasteland.